The sun beat down on the Blackwood Ranch with the fury of a blacksmith's hammer, turning the vast expanse of the Arizona Territory into a shimmering, dusty anvil. Silas Blackwood watched from the wraparound porch of his ranch house, a fortress of timber and stone he'd built with his own 2 hands and the sweat of a dozen hired men. His land stretched as far as the eye could see, a kingdom of cattle, dust, and hard-won dominance. At 40, his face was a roadmap of harsh sun and harsher decisions, his eyes narrowed slits that missed nothing. He was a man who measured worth in acres and head of cattle, and by his own measure, he was a king. So when he saw the small delegation approaching, he felt not curiosity, but annoyance. 3 Apache men on horseback, followed by a woman on a sturdy pinto, moved not with the haste of raiders, but with the solemn pace of a procession. They carried no visible weapons, only the weight of a heavy, unspoken purpose. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Jedediah," he barked, not taking his eyes off the riders. Company, his foreman, a wiry man with a cautious demeanor, appeared at his side. "Apache," Jedediah noted, his voice low. "That's Elder Chachakbe leading them." Silas grunted. "I don't care if it's Geronimo himself. They're on my land." The delegation halted a respectful distance from the house. Chachakbe, a man whose age was etched into the deep canyons of his face, dismounted with a slow grace that defied his years. He approached the porch, his hands open and empty. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "We come to speak of peace." Silas remained seated, a deliberate show of disrespect. "Peace is what happens when people stay on their own land, Chachakbe." The elder did not flinch. "The land changes. The white man's herds drink the rivers dry. The Chiricahua need a new way to survive. We propose an alliance. A bond between our peoples." He gestured back to the woman who had remained on her horse. She was broad-shouldered and thick-set, her round face impassive, her black hair tied back in 2 simple braids. "My niece, Nita, we offer her in marriage to you. A union of our blood will guarantee peace. Your cattle can graze on our lands to the east, and our people will not want for meat." Silas stared. He looked from the stoic elder to the woman on the pinto. He took in her size, her silent stillness. In his world, women were wiry and tough, or they were delicate and decorative. This woman was neither. She was substantial, soft. He imagined her trying to keep up with the hard pace of ranch life, and a sneer curled his lip. A wave of crude laughter began to bubble in his chest. His men, who had gathered nearby to watch, shifted uncomfortably, sensing their boss's mood. He finally let the laugh erupt, a harsh, braying sound that echoed in the dry air. "Marry her?" he roared, pointing a thick finger at Nita. "My God, Chachakbe, is this a joke? I need a wife, not another mouth to feed my prize bull to. She looks like she'd break a horse's back just by sitting on it." The ranch hands chuckled nervously, following their master's lead. Silas stood up, emboldened by their reaction. He strode to the edge of the porch, looking directly at Nita, who had not moved a muscle. Her dark eyes met his, and for a fleeting second, he saw something that wasn't shame or fear. It was an unnerving calmness, a deep, placid current beneath a still surface. "You come onto my land and offer me a woman who's slower than a 3-legged cow and expect me to give up my grazing rights?" He scoffed. "Take your fat bride and your pathetic offer and get off my property before I have my men run you off." Chachakbe's face remained a mask of stone, but a deep disappointment settled in his eyes. He said nothing. He simply turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted. The other warriors followed suit. Nita gave Silas one last, lingering look. It was not a look of anger or humiliation, but of assessment. It was the look a hunter gives an animal just before it walks into a trap. Then she turned her pinto, and the delegation rode away, swallowed by the same dust from which they had emerged, leaving only a profound silence in their wake. The roar of laughter from Silas's men followed the Apache delegation like a physical blow as they rode away from the ranch. Inside the main house, Silas slammed a heavy bottle of whiskey on the rough-hewn table, the sound echoing his triumphant mood. He poured generous amounts for his foreman, his face flushed with victory and drink. "Did you see the look on that old man's face?" Silas bellowed, his voice thick with contempt. "Bringing me his oversized niece as some kind of peace offering, as if I'd chain myself to a buffalo just to share a few streams." His men laughed along with him, their loyalty bought with cheap whiskey and the promise of power. Only Jed, an older hand with sun-cracked skin and eyes that had seen more than his share of Arizona seasons, swirled his drink without smiling. "They took the insult without a word, boss," Jed said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "That ain't like the Apache, not the ones I know." Silas waved a dismissive hand. "They're weak, Jed, starving. They came to us because they have nothing left." That silence wasn't pride, it was desperation. They know who holds the power now. He took a long swallow of whiskey, the fire in his belly matching the arrogance in his heart. "They won't be a problem." But miles away, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the desert canyons in hues of orange and purple, a very different scene was unfolding. The Apache delegation rode not in shame, but in a profound, contemplative silence. The humiliation they had endured was a heavy cloak, but beneath it, the embers of resolve were being fanned into a flame. They reached their hidden encampment nestled between mesas, just as the first stars pricked the indigo sky. Nita dismounted, her movements fluid and deliberate, belying the bulk Silas had so cruelly mocked. She didn't retreat to a private dwelling to weep or rage. Instead, she walked to the center of the camp, where a fire was already burning. Her uncle, Chachakbi, and the other elders followed, their expressions now unreadable masks. Chachakbi finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with the gravity of the day. "The white man is a fool, blinded by his own greed. I am sorry, Nita, that I subjected you to his vile tongue." Nita looked into the flames, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing light. "You did not subject me to anything, uncle. We gave him a choice. A final chance to choose peace over pride. He made his decision." Her voice was low and even, devoid of the hurt or anger one might expect. It was the calm, measured tone of a leader assessing a failed negotiation. From the shadows, others emerged. They were not elders, but younger, harder-looking men and women. They were riders, trackers, and hunters, the sharpest eyes and quietest feet of their people. They didn't look to Chachakbi, their gazes were fixed on Nita. One of them, a lean rider named Kale, stepped forward. "His cattle drink from Willow Creek. They graze on the tall grass of the northern basin," he stated, not as a piece of information, but as a report. Nita nodded slowly. "He believes his fences, and his armed men are his strength. He doesn't understand that the land itself dictates the terms." She turned from the fire to face them, her large frame casting a commanding shadow. "He mocked us. He believes we are weak because we do not have what he has. He is about to learn that our strength lies in what we know." She looked at each of them, her gaze lingering for a moment. This was her true family, her army. They were bound not by blood alone, but by a shared understanding and a fierce loyalty to her strategic mind. For years, she had been the one to plan their trade routes, to find new water sources, to negotiate with other tribes. The marriage proposal had been her idea, a final, genuine attempt to avoid conflict and forge a future where both their peoples could survive. "He called me a burden," Nita said, the words hanging in the cool night air. "Tomorrow, he will learn what a burden truly is." She paused, letting the weight of her statement settle. "We will not harm his men, we will not shed blood, we will simply move his wealth. At dawn, every head of his cattle will be gone from his pastures. We will scatter them through the canyons, where his men will take weeks to find them, if they ever do. He will be a king with an empty kingdom." A quiet, determined consensus filled the air. There were no shouts of war, only grim nods of understanding. This was not about revenge, it was a lesson in power. Nita gave the final command. "Go, move like shadows. By the time the sun touches the top of his ranch house, let the only sound he hears be the wind blowing across empty fields." The first light of dawn was a hesitant, gray wash that painted the Arizona landscape in shades of charcoal and silver. It was a cold, sharp light that promised a blistering day to come. But for now, The desert air held a deep, profound chill. In this quiet, liminal space between night and day, Nita's plan unfolded with the silent efficiency of a river finding its path through rock. Her people moved not as warriors, but as whispers on the wind. They wore soft-soled moccasins that made no sound on the packed earth and communicated with hand signals sharpened by generations of use. There were no war cries, no shouts, only the rustle of leather, the soft snort of a horse, and the low, persuasive calls they used to calm and guide the cattle. Nita sat on her mare atop a low mesa, a still silhouette against the brightening sky. From her vantage point, she could see the entire operation. Her trackers worked in small, coordinated groups, flowing around the edges of Sela's Blackwood's vast herd like water. They weren't stampeding the animals. That would be noisy and chaotic. Instead, they were applying subtle, relentless pressure, exploiting the herd's natural instincts. A shadow moved here, a pebble tossed there, a rider appearing for a moment on a ridge before vanishing. They gently but firmly split the massive group into smaller, more manageable clusters, guiding each one into different arroyos, canyons, and hidden valleys that crisscrossed the land, places Sela's men rarely ventured. Back at the Blackwood Ranch, the morning began with the groans of men nursing headaches from the previous night's cheap whiskey. The air was thick with the smell of stale smoke and fried bacon. Silas emerged from his main house, squinting against the growing light. He felt a smug satisfaction, the memory of the Apache elder's strained face and the woman's blank expression fueling his arrogance. "Jed," he bellowed, his voice rough, "get the boys moving. We've got a long day." Jed, his seasoned foreman, was already by the coffee pot, his weathered face etched with a familiar concern. "Something ain't right, Silas." "What are you talking about?" Silas grumbled, pouring himself a cup. "It's the quiet," Jed said, gesturing with his mug toward the vast grazing pastures. "Too quiet. Shouldn't be able to hear a man think this time of morning. We should be hearing the herd." Silas listened for a moment. Jed was right. The constant, low rumble of thousands of cattle, a sound so familiar it was usually just background noise, was gone. An unnerving silence had taken its place, broken only by the wind whistling through the eaves of the barn. A knot of irritation tightened in his gut. Probably just moved further south for water. "Stop spooking yourself, old man. Get a few riders and check the southern pasture." An hour later, the riders returned, their horses lathered and their faces pale. They galloped into the ranch yard, kicking up dust. "They're gone, boss," a young cowboy yelled, his voice cracking with disbelief. "All of 'em?" Silas's smugness evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. He mounted his own horse, ignoring Jed's cautioning hand, and rode out with his men. He crested the hill that overlooked his primary grazing land, the very heart of his wealth and power. He pulled his horse to a sudden, violent stop. The sight before him was impossible. The sprawling valley, which yesterday had been a sea of brown and white hides, was now empty, utterly, devastatingly empty. The grass was trampled, the ground littered with droppings, proof the cattle had been there, but the animals themselves had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. His men fanned out, their shouts echoing in the void, searching for any sign, any track. But the tracks they found were baffling, leading in a dozen different directions, expertly braided and scattered to be almost untraceable. There was no sign of a stampede, no evidence of a large-scale cattle raid. It was simply an absence, a silent, gaping wound in the heart of his empire. Silas stared, his face contorting from disbelief into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He had been mocked, not with arrows or rifles, but with silence. He had been disarmed, not by force, but by a cunning he couldn't comprehend. The Apache, it had to be them, that woman. Her final, calculating look burned in his memory. It wasn't a look of defeat, it was a promise. The silence of the dawn was replaced by the thunder of Sela's Blackwood's rage. He stood on his porch, the empty expanse of his pastures, a personal insult that burned hotter than the rising Arizona sun. His face was a mask of crimson fury, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He didn't feel shame or regret. He felt a deep, primal violation. They had dared to touch what was his. "Saddle up," he roared, his voice echoing across the unnaturally quiet ranch. "Every man who can ride, grab your rifles and fill your canteens. We're not coming back until every last steer is recovered and every last one of them savages pays." His men, nursing hangovers and a growing sense of dread, scrambled to obey. Jedediah, his oldest and most level-headed ranch hand, approached cautiously. "Silas, maybe we should think this through. We don't know this land like they do. Riding in blind, it's what they'll be expecting." Silas spun on him, his eyes blazing. "I don't pay you to think, Jedediah. I pay you to ride. They've left a trail a blind man could follow. They're arrogant. We'll run them down before noon." He jabbed a finger toward the distant, hazy mountains. "They can't hide 1,000 head of cattle. Now get your horse." Within the hour, a posse of 15 men thundered out of the Blackwood Ranch, a chaotic cloud of dust and curses. They were heavily armed, overconfident, and fueled by their boss's fury. As Silas predicted, the trail was unmistakable. A wide, scarred path of churned earth and dropped dung leading straight into the foothills. The ease of the chase fed their arrogance. They spurred their horses on, laughing and making crude jokes about what they'd do when they caught up to the thieves. But as the sun climbed higher, the terrain began to change. The gentle, rolling hills gave way to a labyrinth of narrow canyons and rock-strewn arroyos. The air grew still and suffocatingly hot, the heat radiating off the red canyon walls. The trail, once so clear, started to play tricks on them. It would lead them toward a sheer rock face, forcing a long, time-consuming detour, or split impossibly around a thicket of thorny mesquite. From a high ridge unseen, Nita watched their clumsy progress. She had anticipated this exact reaction. The easy trail was bait. Every twist and turn that frustrated the ranchers was a deliberate choice, designed to herd them, not the cattle. Her trackers, moving like ghosts on the periphery, would occasionally dislodge a rock or guide a lone steer across a distant ridge, creating sounds that echoed through the canyons and drew the posse deeper into the maze. They were being led into a trap carved by nature itself. By late afternoon, the ranchers' bravado had evaporated, replaced by a grim, sweat-soaked exhaustion. Their canteens were half empty, and the horses were starting to stumble on the treacherous footing. "Silas, we've got to rest the animals," Jedediah pleaded, his voice raspy. "And we're heading deeper into Apache territory with every step. This is a bad idea." "Quiet," Silas snapped, refusing to show any sign of weakness. His own frustration was mounting, a corrosive acid in his gut. They should have caught them by now. The feeling of being outsmarted was even more infuriating than the loss of his cattle. He spurred his weary horse forward, ignoring the murmurs of dissent from his men. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, the trail led them into a box canyon. The tracks of the herd, which they had followed so desperately all day, simply vanished into a dozen smaller trails that disappeared up the steep, rocky slopes. It was an impossible dead end. The air grew cold with the setting sun. They were surrounded by towering walls of stone, lost and utterly exhausted. The hunters had become the hunted, and as a profound, unnerving silence descended, every man in Silas's posse finally understood the depth of their mistake. They weren't just lost, they were trapped. Darkness fell not like a blanket, but like a stone, plunging the box canyon into an oppressive, inky blackness. The towering rock walls, which had been their prison by day, became monstrous silhouettes against a stardusted sky. The campfire, small and hungry for their dwindling supply of dry brush, cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye. Every gust of wind whistling through the narrow canyon entrance sounded like a whisper, every rustle of a desert creature like a footstep. Silas sat apart from his men, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His rage had cooled, leaving behind a hard, cold knot of dread in his stomach. He was a master of his own land, a man who could read the sun and the terrain like a book. But here, he was illiterate, blind. This was their land, and they were making him feel it in his very bones. It began subtly. A single, mournful bird call echoed from the rim of the canyon, It was answered moments later from the opposite side. One of his men, a young hand named Jeb, shifted uneasily. "What kind of bird calls at night like that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. No one answered. The calls continued, a strange, disorienting melody that seemed to come from everywhere at once, pinning them in the center of an unseen circle. Then came the rocks. A small pebble would skitter down the cliff face to their left. A few minutes later, a cascade of gravel would tumble down on their right. It was never enough to be a real threat, but it was just enough to shatter their nerves, to keep them from rest. Each sound was a reminder, "We are here, we are watching you." Sleep was impossible. The men huddled closer to the fire, their eyes wide, scanning the impenetrable darkness. Silas pretended to be unfazed, staring into the flames with a stony expression, but his hand never strayed far from the pistol at his hip. He felt like a cornered animal, and the feeling was maddening. When the merciless Arizona sun finally crested the canyon rim, it brought no relief. The men rose, stiff and exhausted, their faces etched with fear. It was then that Hank, his oldest ranch hand, made the discovery. "The canteens, they're nearly empty," he said, his voice a dry rasp of disbelief. He held one up, shaking it. Only a pathetic slosh answered. Panic rippled through the group. They had been careful, rationing what little they had left. "How?" Silas demanded, snatching a canteen. "We slept right here." "Maybe they leaked," someone offered weakly, but they all knew it wasn't true. Sometime in the dead of night, while they were distracted by the noises and the shadows, someone had slipped among them, silent as a ghost, and drained their most precious resource. They hadn't seen or heard a thing. The realization was more terrifying than any open attack. That was the final straw for a young rancher named Caleb. "We're gonna die here," he whimpered, his face pale under his sunburn. "This is your fault, Silas, you and your damn pride. We should have just left the cattle." "Shut your mouth, boy," Silas snarled, his authority crumbling into raw aggression. But the accusation hung in the dry, hot air. The other men looked away, but their silence was an agreement. They saw it in each other's eyes. The shared fear, the dawning resentment. Their confidence in him was gone, siphoned away in the night along with their water. Silas looked at their drawn, desperate faces. He saw the end of their loyalty. He was no longer their leader. He was just the man who had led them into a tomb. And as the sun climbed higher, beating down on the canyon floor with a relentless, baking heat, he finally understood. Nita wasn't trying to kill them with arrows or bullets. She was letting the land do it for her. She was orchestrating their demise, and they had walked right onto her stage. The morning sun was a cruel blade, slicing over the canyon rim to expose the raw despair etched onto the faces of Silas Blackwood's men. The previous night's psychological assault had stripped them of their bravado, leaving behind hollow-eyed husks of men who now understood the true meaning of being hunted. Dehydration was a physical torment, their tongues thick and their throats like sandpaper. Jed, the old hand, was methodically trying to slice open a barrel cactus with a dull knife, his movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to Silas's agitated pacing. His pride in tatters, Silas knew his control was slipping away with every passing minute. He had to reassert his authority, to give them a target for their hope, however slim. He stopped abruptly and pointed a shaking finger at the sheerest, most imposing wall of the canyon. "There," he announced, his voice raspy. "We climb. They'll expect us to try the gentler slopes, the fissures. They'll never expect us to go straight up. It's our only way out." Jed looked up from his cactus, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "That's suicide, Silas," he said, his voice flat. "We ain't got the strength of a newborn kitten. We're parched, tired, and spooked. A man would need a clear head and all his power to make that climb. We'll fall before we're a third of the way up." A murmur of agreement rippled through the exhausted men. It was the final straw for Silas. His face contorted with rage. "So we just sit here and die? Like rats in a barrel?" he spat, striding toward Jed. "I'm still the boss of this outfit. You were the boss when we had a chance," another man, Finn, mumbled from the ground. "You led us into this." The accusation hung in the dry air, a truth so sharp it silenced everyone. Silas's authority had evaporated. He was no longer a leader, he was just the architect of their doom. Seeing this final breakdown, two of the younger men, Dale and Finn, exchanged a panicked glance. They saw no hope in following Silas and no future in waiting for death. Scrambling to their feet, they made a silent pact. With a desperate burst of adrenaline, they sprinted towards a narrow fissure in the rock wall they had noticed earlier, a dark crack that promised a chance at freedom. Silas yelled after them, but his words were empty. High above, hidden in the rocks, Nita watched their desperate flight without emotion. She gave a subtle hand signal. Her trackers, masters of this terrain, did not need to show themselves. Their intervention was invisible, a ghost in the landscape. As Dale and Finn scrambled into the fissure, a single pebble was dislodged from above, clattering down just behind them, pushing them forward. The path twisted and turned, a natural maze. A raven's call, seemingly from their left, made them instinctively veer right, deeper into the labyrinth. The echoes in the tight space played tricks on their ears, disorienting them, turning their panicked flight into a blind stumble. For nearly an hour, they clawed their way through the oppressive rock, the sun disappearing and reappearing as the path snaked around. They were convinced they were heading away from the main canyon, towards salvation. Then, dehydrated and gasping for breath, they stumbled out of an opening and fell to their knees on the sandy ground. As their vision cleared, a crushing wave of despair washed over them. They were back in the main canyon, not 50 yards from where their ordeal began. The rest of the posse was staring at them, their faces grim. The lesson was brutal and absolute. There was no escape. Nita was not just trapping them. She was toying with them, proving the utter futility of resistance. The sight of the two defeated men broke the last vestiges of spirit. The group was truly finished. They slumped against the canyon walls, a collection of broken men resigned to their fate. Just as the silence became unbearable, movement on the rim drew their eyes upward. Against the brilliant blue Arizona sky, two figures stood. They were not an army of warriors with drawn bows, but Elder Chachakbi, his posture erect and dignified, and beside him Nita. Her silhouette was solid, immovable. She held no weapon, yet she commanded the entire canyon. Chachakbi's voice, calm and powerful, echoed down to them. "Silas Blackwood, you have trespassed. You have dishonored my family. You have chosen arrogance over peace." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And now you are at our mercy." Silas stared up, his jaw slack, his face a canvas of disbelief and utter humiliation. His gaze fixed on Nita, the quiet, heavy-set woman he had so cruelly mocked. Her expression was unreadable from this distance, but her power was absolute. She had defeated him without spilling a drop of his blood, using only her mind and the very land he sought to dominate. She held their lives in her hand. The dawn broke over the canyon rim, casting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers toward the defeated men below. Silas Blackwood stared upward, his face a mask of dust and dried sweat. The figures of Nita and Elder Chachakbi were silhouetted against the rising sun, an undeniable portrait of power. The air was still, the psychological torment of the night replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. "Silas Blackwood," Elder Chachakbi's voice boomed, echoing off the rock walls. It carried the weight of generations. "You have trespassed on our patience as you have trespassed on our lands. You have sown scorn and now you reap desperation." Silas's jaw tightened, but he had no response. His men looked between him and the figures above, their expressions a mixture of fear and a desperate plea for salvation. Then, Nita stepped forward. She did not raise her voice, yet it cut through the morning air with absolute clarity. "My uncle offers wisdom, I offer terms." Every eye was on her. She was no longer the silent, heavy-set woman from the ranch, but a commander on her field of victory. "First," she began, "the land north of Mesquite Creek, which your fences have slowly consumed, will be returned. It holds the springs our people have used since before your grandfather saw this desert. Your fences will be moved by the next full moon." Silas flinched. That was his best grazing land. Second, she continued, her gaze unwavering, you will bring 20 head of your finest cattle to our camp as a gift. Not as payment, but as a gesture of goodwill to begin a new relationship. In return, we will ensure safe passage for your men and your herds through these territories. It was not a demand for his whole herd back, but a foundation for a future trade, an alliance he had so foolishly rejected. And third, Nita's voice grew firm, leaving no room for negotiation. You, Silas Blackwood, will come to our camp, and in the presence of my people and your men, you will apologize. You will apologize for the insult to me and for the disrespect shown to my tribe. A wave of pure, unadulterated humiliation washed over Silas. Apologize in front of everyone? His pride, the last thing he had left, roared in defiance. Never, he rasped, his voice raw with thirst. But then a cracked voice rose from beside him. It was Miller, his oldest ranch hand. Boss, please, we ain't gonna make it out of here otherwise. Look at the men. Silas looked. He saw faces hollowed out by fear, lips cracked from dehydration, spirits completely shattered. They weren't his loyal posse anymore. They were broken survivors. His authority was an illusion, evaporated under the relentless Arizona sun and Nita's even more relentless strategy. The choice was not between pride and shame, but between life and a slow, agonizing death in this rocky prison. He dropped his gaze, the dust at his feet suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. He gave a single, jerky nod. 3 days later, Silas stood in the center of the Apache camp. He was clean but haggard, his best clothes hanging loosely on his frame. His men stood behind him, silent witnesses. The Apache people formed a wide circle, their faces stern and watchful. He looked for Nita and found her standing beside her uncle, her expression unreadable. He had rehearsed the words, but they felt like ash in his mouth. He cleared his throat. I am Silas Blackwood, he began, his voice hoarse. He forced himself to look directly at Nita. I spoke with arrogance and ignorance. I misjudged you and I insulted your people. For my words, for my actions, I apologize. The words were clipped, forced from his lungs, but they were spoken. A murmur went through the crowd. Nita held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. She did not smile in triumph. She simply accepted the fulfillment of her terms. Her victory needed no embellishment. She turned and spoke to her people in their native tongue, her voice calm and assured. The tension in the circle eased. Water, skins, and food were brought forward and given to Silas's men. It was a gesture of finality, a closing of the conflict. As Silas and his men prepared to leave, he cast one last look at Nita. She was speaking with a group of children, her back to him. She had not sought vengeance. She had sought justice and secured a future. He had mocked her appearance, but he would forever be haunted by the power of her mind. He rode away a smaller man from a land that now felt vastly larger than he had ever imagined.